Assalamualaikum and good morning to the Honorable Yang Berbahagia Dato Professor Dr. Husaini bin Omar, Director General of Higher Education, Department of Higher Education, Ministry of Higher Education, Malaysia. Our keynote speaker, distinguished Professor Dato Rajah Rasiah, respected professors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We are back on the second day of the 7th Global Higher Education Forum 2021 with the theme Disruptive Era, Higher Education at the Crossroads.
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to introduce Professor Dato Dr. Morshidi Sirat, Honorary Professor of University Sains Malaysia, who will moderate our keynote presentation of the day. Professor Dato Dr. Morshidi was a former professor and founding director of the Commonwealth Tertiary Education Facility at Universiti Sains Malaysia. He was also the former Director General of Higher Education, Registrar General for Private Institutes of Higher Education Malaysia, the former Vice Chancellor of Universiti Malaysia Sarawak, UNIMAS, and had served as the Director of IPPTN from April 2002 until January of 2011. Since 2015, and with the launch of Sustainable Development Goals (SDG), Professor Dato Dr. Morshidi has undertaken several studies in Malaysia and abroad on SDG 4 quality education. In 2017 and 2018, he coordinated a study on doctoral education in Commonwealth Africa and a study on funding for higher education in Commonwealth South Pacific countries. So please welcome Professor Dato Dr. Morshidi Sirat.
Assalamualaikum. A very good morning, a very good afternoon, a very good evening, depending on where you are watching this presentation, this Global Higher Education Forum. Let me introduce to you our distinguished speaker, distinguished Professor Dato Rajah Rasiah. He is a distinguished Professor of Economics at the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya. He obtained his doctorate in economics from Cambridge University in 1992 and was a Rajawali Fellow at the Ash Center for Innovation and Democratic Governance, Harvard University in 2014. Among his external positions include Professorial Fellow position at UNU Merit, Technology Management and Center for Development at Oxford University, Center for Rising Powers, Cambridge University, Muhammad Ali Jinnah University, and University Tenaga Nasional. He is also a fellow of the Academy of Science Malaysia, member of the Advisory Board of Research Projects at the Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia and Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, Morshidi, Malaysia. He served as the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Administration at Universiti Malaya in 2009 to 2010 and 2013 to 2014. He was also one of the principal authors of UNIDO's 29 flagship report and one of the editors of the 2015 UNESCO Science Report and contributors to the UNESCO Science Report in 2021. He is the 2014 recipient of the Celso Furtado Prize from the World Academy of Sciences for advancing the frontiers of social science thought. In light of his scholastic contribution, Malaysia's Ministry of Higher Education conferred him the award of Distinguished Professor in Economics in 2017. He was awarded the Medical Prize for Scholastic Excellence in 2018 and conferred the title Datuk Paduka Mahkota Perak in 2019. Today, Professor Rajah Rasiah will speak to us on the title Disruptive and Unprecedented Times Toward Economic and Financial Sustainability of Higher Education. Without much further ado, let us listen to Professor Rajah. I've given him enough time for him to deliver his presentation material. There's good set of material, important, very interesting material. So I'm giving him enough time to cover all the topics that he is going to present. And I'll come back later to say a few words together with the Q&A session. So sit back and listen to his presentation. So over to you, Professor Dato Rasiah.
Thank you very much, Professor Dato Morshidi Sirat, and thank you to the organizers too for inviting me to deliver this keynote speech. I shall now try to share screen. I hope my screen is visible. Let me organize the. Okay, this is the screen. And the title given to me is Disruptive and Unprecedented Times Towards Economic and Financial Sustainability of Higher Education. While the focus now has largely been on concerns about the pandemic that we are facing, which is ravaging the world, and concerns about whether we will manage to sustain student enrollment as well as maturing into graduates. I think we should also address the fundamentals of what higher education meant for in a philosophical sense. So I'll try to address both of them. And at the same time, in as much as we focus on the changing times, which was already happening, although not at such a pace before the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic struck, but it was already happening because of enormous changes in technology. Now, my key points will be a focus on higher education promotion across selected countries. I'll give as examples. The only reason I chose a few simply because you can't actually figure out when you have too many dots in a scatter plot. Higher education expenditure trends of countries by developmental stages. Higher education enrollment trends of countries by development stages. These are also there so that you can have a picture of that. Rising digitalization and increasing proliferation of IR 4.0 technologies into education. In doing so, we will also address the element of humans being social beings rather than economic beings, which is part of the reason why there is a trend rise in mental health problems as we try to become more and more impersonal with the proliferation of new technologies. Early reactions. This was already happening in the return of some of the companies simply trying to circumvent, avoid China because of trade friction between these countries. It already started with Michelle Obama, except that Trump took a drastic step in imposing quotas and tariffs. Outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic from early 2020. Of course, then we deal with coping with the changing landscape of these disruptions on the demand for higher education. Can also address supply issues. Then we try to conjecture, since it's still very much unfolding, I rather not simply in a simplistic or reductionist manner give you conclusions about what we should actually do. Instead, I will open up the discussion so that in the Q&A, we can collectively try to fill those gaps. So education as a basic need simply goes to the point of exposing people to raising the literacy rates, the capacity to think, reflect, and to deploy these techniques in their day-to-day life. That's a basic need, but it's not a basic need to claim that participation in the university is essential. Or for that matter, to do a doctorate with a focus on creating new stocks of knowledge or undertaking research as important as a basic need. Now that's one element of it, and that element I think in our classification in economics we call utilities, because you need more and more classrooms. You need more, even if it means that you're connecting people with Zoom. You need more facilities, the infrastructure, digitalized infrastructure to to embrace them, to absorb them. So all that means that you can exclude these people and you have additional costs. But when you look at it as a public good, it's both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. What that actually means is that once you create knowledge, the knowledge is already there. You don't have to keep investing money or reinventing the wheel to produce that knowledge. And that's non-excludable, despite the fact that you have so many entities trying to impose copyrights, define them as intellectual property, and therefore impose prices on them. However much they do, it still seeps through. That's one element of non-excludable. Non-rivalrous, it means that once you create it, you don't have to invest money to produce it again. You can keep using the same good for which the costs have already been incurred. Now, there are, of course, lots of people interested in taking advantage of education as a private good. Now, herein lies lots of differences, whether you come from the perspective of markets being the dominant influence and therefore let prices. Remember, markets refer to prices. They don't refer to needs. So those people who are not able to produce, to enjoy that because they don't have the capacity to pay, those people are not in markets. So it means that it tends to move away to a select group of people we call haves over the have-nots. And again, haves and have-nots depends on the clearing price in terms of what the educational good is. Now, important in as much we say that, if we take it as a point where society as a whole benefits, now public good includes the global common, the environment we are in. It includes the environment because whatever happens in any part of the world has a bearing on other parts of the world. This is the classic Garrett Hardin's definition in 1968 of the tragedy of commons. If you keep saying that, well, we don't care about somebody else over the other side, it's just like the haze that we got from Sumatra. But we will also face the haze because that's a global common. That's a public good in a broader sense. And so I just wanted to make these sort of points, and then governments will have to think about what they should do, because higher education requires enormous amount of investments, and I'll show you some trends specific, especially on Malaysia, to make that point. Education focus, primary, secondary, tertiary, and technical training, we'll deal with that. Higher education enrollment and expenditure, I'll come into that. And of course, the higher education focus. A lot of them think about it as developmental, although its origins have very much to do with how philosophy evolved. The first discipline in the world, every other discipline was born from philosophy. If you remember, during the great Greek times, Archimedes did everything, Plato did everything, because that's the only discipline then. One after another, the disciplines were born. Some kept their link, the umbilical cord remained. Some cut the umbilical cord off. Economics is one field that has become like that, detached from the mother, from the parents. Of course, there are many who promote higher education as an income source. We too did that, and we are very much hoping to continue with that by even attracting lots of students from abroad. Stimulation of research and innovation. Some countries emphasize standards, while some countries had this dual system of getting students who would eventually play a role in their innovation, national innovation systems, while another set came to bring in money as a source of income. The US will be that.
Rajah, can you have your slide share, your slide, full slides?
My slides are here, yes.
No, but you are on the, you're not on the what do you call it? The full slides.
Oh, you want it full, but then I can't see the time, okay.
Okay. Then the audience will
okay.
not able to see the slides. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Keynote.
No problem. And then attracting talent. Countries like the US would not grow as fast if only they didn't see foreign students as talent. In fact, they give them green cards the moment they support their capacity to participate in the innovation systems. Something that Japan, Korea, and so on have taken on quite seriously now, including Germany. Higher education and R&D, and if you, I'll come to those specific things as we get to those slides. Significance of higher education among latecomers and first movers. It's important to note that higher education doesn't figure very much in the early stages, simply because countries are, say, the least developed countries haven't got the capacity to finance these things, these resources, and therefore you don't really see these things very much. But if you left it to market forces, they won't be able to do it. And therefore, it is imperative that countries, even if they had been poor, an example would be South Korea, which was poorer than Malaysia until by per capita income terms 1979, when the second oil crisis struck. Korea's per capita income now is around 3 times that of Malaysia, but simply because it focused extensively on issues like this. Now, the quadruple helix has become important since the Vinnova triple helix model evolved into a quadruple helix model in Sweden. Our Malaysian government, among other governments, embraced this after the Sustainable Development Goals were launched. Now, it has a university as one of the corners of the quadruple helix. Industry, government, university, industry, government, and the civil society, except that in Malaysia, we seem to have, to some extent, misunderstood civil society there, because our civil society in the quadruple helix, as I see it, because I'm in the advisory board of Morshidi now, are entities like FMM, when it should be those concerned about the environment, those concerned about the poor, issues of that kind. Now let's look at subsequently governance of universities in national innovation systems. Now in our quest to understand, comprehend, and solve the problems of falling foreign student interest, we need to understand that we need to classify, especially higher education, as a conduit, as a reservoir to support the build-up of our university systems, national innovation systems. This is important. This is gross tertiary enrollment. If you look at it, this is it sometimes exceeds 100 because those who are retaining from the previous years, they end up making it. And Korea had the highest just after the millennium, turn of the millennium, but it's still at a much higher compared to, say, the United States, which is a more developed country, although it's not that much higher than Korea. But you have countries like Malaysia. As far as enrollment is concerned, we are still relatively low. I have figures until 2019. The dotted lines in blue. If you use the cursor, I'm not sure my yeah. This is Malaysia's line. It's the lowest at the moment when you compare with these comparable countries. I included even Philippines over there and Indonesia with 270 million people. It's got higher enrollment in higher education. Tertiary share in total education expenditure. Overall expenditure tertiary, we were really high earlier to the point of UNESCO applauding us as a country that has shown the way for many years, higher than most of the rest. But we have then subsequently fallen. We have subsequently fallen significantly, although we are not the lowest now, simply because of cutback on grants to do R&D, research, and so on and so forth, which has brought our shares that much lower, but not that much lower than many other countries there. Universities and innovation systems, I would even call universities as a key integral pivot of innovation systems. The propellants of economic and social synergies in particular geographical spaces is best captured by focusing on the following 4 systemic pillars. Actually, I developed this simply because Michael Porter's clusters don't actually explain how underdeveloped locations evolve to become mature clusters. Instead, he talks about how mature clusters can actually retain their sustainability in terms of how they contain or support frontier firms. Now, in here, my focus is really on science, technology, and innovation infrastructure. In fact, this is where most of my contributions to UNESCO reports are on. Higher education is important in the development of the science, technology, and innovation infrastructure that produce public goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, the point that I did explain earlier, such as knowledge, environment, and security. The infrastructure involved for knowledge upgrading, embodied and disembodied, include science parks, incubators in them, research universities, testing centers, skills development centers, broadband infrastructure to support digitalization, and of course the spread of 4.0 Industry Revolution 4.0 Technologies and Standards Organization. Malaysia did the right thing by launching the Way Forward in 1991, except that our science parks have now largely become what they call white elephants, because they are not powering, they are not fueling technological upgrading in firms in the way Taiwan has managed, for example. The E3 labs that have not only supported upgrading the universities, but also firms to become world-class firms. And we need to look at that. And in the same way, though not in the same sort of organization, the Koreans, how they managed to have, of course, initially because of the failure of public labs, Korea tended to have large firms internalizing these activities to support innovation. But today, they actually work much more coherently, the way the Silicon Valley, Route 128 in the US or the Technopolis in Europe have evolved. Network cohesion is connectivity in that sense. If you look at this element, it's important to note that since the government started financing R&D grants in Malaysia, we have done extremely well in one thing, which has helped raise university ranking. Lots of our national universities have risen in the university rankings because we have managed to publish extensively in scientific journals. That we have succeeded. We cannot say that this hasn't happened because we have actually indeed done that. Except that we have not managed to translate that, commercialize that into real innovation output to propel Malaysia to a developed country. That's an area that we should have focused on, something that Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and China have largely succeeded in doing it. And university is an integral part of that sort of activity. It's not simply there to produce graduates, which is of course an integral part of objective for universities, but universities as knowledge centers that produce new stocks of knowledge or knowledge that's incremental, not necessarily simply only radical. Now, the element of global integration. This is an important element we promote. In fact, Dr. Morshidi himself may be involved in this too. We have collaborative activities, actively collaborating research with foreign universities. That's an important part of global integration, not just simply exporting and importing goods, even though that's an element that's important too. And therefore, we can identify knowledge centers in specific areas and work with them, the way American and British universities or Australian universities do in the third world, including where it involves specific, say, biopharma, where it involves particular species and so on, that is very integral to a particular space. They work with those scientists, even if it means that they do the knowledge creation part of it, which I never enjoyed very much, simply because the developing countries should participate horizontally with them, not just as laboratories that are used by these countries. This is the point I was trying to put across, and the focus is on science, technology, innovation, infrastructure. Universities are key players here. Now, what it means is that when we envisage investments for higher education, we cannot compromise on that. A counter example would be Britain. When I was studying at Cambridge, Margaret Thatcher was still there as Prime Minister. She was confronted with this question because she was trying to upgrade the polytechnics into universities. The Liberal Party rep, Eddie Ashton, was making the point, are we trying to dilute, adulterate our university standards? So those graduates going out might actually perform badly for the country. Her response was, I was surprised. I was listening to parliamentary debate. Her response was, they are there to produce graduates because we are no longer competitive in manufacturing, in industry. These are for developing countries. They'll go back to work in their own country. They would not affect our own capacities. Now, we should not think along those lines because that leads to what you call negative deindustrialization, because you deindustrialize but without really raising productivity, and you move on to different sectors, with service becoming an important driver of overall economic growth. But I think the focus should be on not compromising on that. It's okay to upgrade the polytechnic, but not on the basis of simply using it as a source of making money, because universities are the highest perched academic institutions that produce new stocks of knowledge. And we should always remember the capacity that they can provide. Something we have not seriously reasoned, because in Malaysia, we still do not have it open enough for foreign talent that is considered potential Nobel laureates, for example, to be given green cards. We still haven't thought about those options, even though I did try to discuss this with Dato Tan Sri Gaut, and he actually brought this matter to the Prime Minister. He was very receptive, but not implemented subsequently. So this means the digital infrastructure also brings universities. When you merge virtual with augmented realities, you can do so many different things. You can have travelers, buses, all sorts of things. Universities should be a cornerstone of that. We have Industry 4.0 centers. I'm advisor to that center in, say, University of Malaya, but we also have it in UTM in many other places. But how much of it is appropriated in technological synergies? I don't think very much, because I wrote the Southeast Asian chapter for UNESCO 2021 report. Singapore and Malaysia launched at the same time, 2012. They have actually created all these driverless buses at airports, at universities, and so on, but we haven't done those things yet. Yet we have capabilities. We have Dream Age, we have Aerodyne, we have so many other technology players who could actually, if harnessed properly with university 4.0 centers, we can move in that sort of direction. And these are things that allow for universities to play a more productive role in society on the part of creating a sophisticated university-based knowledge. Artificial intelligence transfer to robots and drones to raise spread accuracy and autonomous control through merging. This is the point I raised just now. But it also involves, say, you could do farming. The scientist doesn't need to be going on to Cameron Highlands or Sarawak or Sabah. They can remain in USM. And yet, through this means, they can actually function by looking at how such spaces are transformed and yet able to monitor at the same time. I've observed this doing the UNIDO study when I went to see salmon farming in Chile. I was in Puerto Montt observing it. Enablers of university role. Now, these are all critical aspects. We have broadband, but not necessarily throughout the whole country. We need to utilize much more. We already have digital infrastructure, but we need to use more. The idea of using more is not about seeing whether firms are ready, the way MITI does the promotion of IR 4.0, whether firms are ready and help them. We have to bring it to them. We have to simply bring it to them. This is exactly my advice to Muhammad Ali Jinnah University too. A small entrepreneur is not capable of, say, coming to your university for training because he does everything there. But you can use the digitalized infrastructure to reach him and to convince him because he's not aware of the benefits he will get. That's the task that we should play rather than to see whether the firm filling up a questionnaire to see whether he's ready or to participate and so on. Well, that's the market-based approach, leaving it to the consumer. But the consumer sometimes or more often than not is not aware of many things. And of course, in the end, the consumer has to decide, but still, it's the role of the provider to convince. It's just like when you want to market a product, you cannot just say, well, let's see whether they will have it. An example will be Penang. I think that Morshidi may be aware of this. I remember when Kentucky Fried Chicken ran all these surveys in Penang. And Penang people happily wrote there, well, we have our best foods in the world. We don't think we will be buying Kentucky Fried Chicken. Until KFC decided, let's start a center first. And it was started near a hotel in Penang. I can't remember the name of the hotel now. Now, it was like packed with people going there to buy Kentucky Fried Chicken. So this is how we should, once, I'm not talking about marketing in the wrong sense. Perhaps maybe fast food is not healthy for us. But once we are convinced the government is ready, this is good for the people, then go on, promote it. And in this case, this is really something that we should be thinking about in the broad sense, so that we have robots doing and drones participating extensively. That even includes a recommendation made recently, how do you help the poor who live by the day, and you say they cannot come out because SOP, standard operating procedures, don't allow that. Now, people are talking about the use of drones. If you had the Pandemic Emergency Act, the way Korea had during the Korean War, then you could have had drones going to these guys who are selling, say, tom yum from home, and they can subsequently take it to all this demand without contact between people. All this could have been done, but because we haven't conceived these things. And Tun Mahathir was talking about it as well in the last session I had with him. University-supported intersectoral spread. Now, increased cross-migration of adapted technologies intersectorally is something that the current technologies are promoting extensively. We need to be aware of that. University-supported 4.0 ecosystems. We are moving from mass production to mass customization. This is an important point because in the past, you need mass production meant having scale. Now you can have economics of scope appropriated in a way where you can have that sort of flexibility, not the single conveyor belt that Henry Ford designed originally. Scale-based uniform specialization to scope-based customized specialization. So individual needs can be met provided we know what we're doing. University-supported smart schools. Smartification is the word now, so that we are enabling the minds of even kids who then connect with knowledge nodes that include R&D centers outside in the science parks, incubators, as well as in universities, so that people even young and old can do all these things. Directed and participative inclusive learning. I'm trying to speed up a little bit to be able to finish my presentation. Here you have knowledge synergies as a public good. Someone investing on R&D, say this is the firm, is going to create lots of knowledge. Not all of them is converted to money. It's converted to officially definable intellectual property rights, patents, designs, layers, and trade secrets. If that is done, yes, some call it development, some call it commercialization, some call it innovation. You bring back money. But in the process, knowledge, a whole lot of knowledge is created, and a lot of it is non-monetary or non-pecuniary, which so society as a whole benefits. These are elements that IBM did because it left computer chassis open. So otherwise, you wouldn't have other computer companies. Things some companies don't do, like Microsoft. Microsoft access its original technology that way, then subsequently starts monopolizing, imposing all this patent laws and so on to become a monopoly in that sense. Now, what it means is that if you have a publicly held patent here, government, we cannot just do things about supporting firms that make money. That's fine for the country, but also you can have intellectual property that's publicly held to say produce drugs for everybody in the country. It's how the generic drugs came into being to help people facing AIDS, or even the COVID vaccines now. Now, universities play a critical role here. I would like to bring this back if you have questions on this. Because of time, I shall move on to the next. Now let's look at enrollment and graduation trends in higher education Malaysia. This is for the concern some of you have. Not so much in the context of, because we still haven't focused extensively, even though some universities like Universiti Malaya does attempt at least to retain the really bright foreign students. So using higher education institutions as a platform to promote or support our national innovation system. But down here, it's more about money and issues related to that. For those concerned about that, let's look at the figures. This is the bachelor's enrollment. Bachelor's enrollment, there was a time private institutions had more. That's in 2016. These figures come from the Higher Education Ministry, which they sent me recently. While the climb is steady, over 300,000 for public universities for bachelors, and of course for bachelors we have constraints because bachelors among public universities is highly subsidized, and therefore we actually limit the number of foreign students that we allow compared to graduate studies. There are no such limits because the fees is not fixed. Now, in that sense, the private one is the one that is a bit discouraging because they have not, and especially after the pandemic, there have been a more serious fall in enrollment. This is enrollment. Bachelors graduating, the numbers are falling in both cases from 2019. And the reasons for the public ones, I haven't really researched to find that out, but for the private one, largely because of the early push from 1995 private university bill, I think it's taking effect on settling down on who are the real performers and who are not. But then from 2019, which I believe with regards to the private sector, universities largely because of the pandemic. This is for master's enrollment. Graduate studies, public universities dominate, while the private one has no similar domination as such, even though eventually the public universities have a bigger total. For masters, there is no limitations in increasing fees and so on, and there is no explicit expensive subsidy as such, the way undergraduate studies are supported by our government, in the case of Malaysia. Now, here you have public universities dominating for masters. And of course, the numbers are falling from 2019, and the same with the private universities for similar reasons. I believe this is largely to do with COVID-19, even though a lot of them are still enrolled. A lot of them are still enrolled, and they are in Zoom classes. Masters graduating. You see the numbers for public universities far outweigh that of private universities. And now let's come to for the doctoral students, where I managed to get some reasons talking to officials. Public universities have an advantage over private universities because they have what you call higher and more qualified academics. So they have what you call collective synergy, or having a bigger rather than a selected few. Longer establishment with more facilities, more autonomy to charge fees for graduate students. In fact, foreign students pay higher fees, a similar practice that developed countries do. And the shift to meet ranking requirements means that PhD students play a critical role, especially in the sciences, doing as research assistants and so on, because then they enable the production of more scientific articles, and as well as support getting bigger grants, which are all components of ranking. Doctoral graduation. From 2000, actually it starts earlier, but the decline is more significant because there is a carrying period of a few years PhD students in the stream before they graduate. You find that the number of public universities has been falling. And in the case of private universities from 2019, simply because there's been a complete drying up, and therefore we don't have them. And the second, tightening visa rules, especially for students coming from Nigeria, Iran, and so on, who create a lot of social problems in the country. Some of them come and work and do other kinds of things. This is opinions given to me by officials from the government. So then we have this tightening of graduation requirements, and therefore you see these numbers falling. Here you have foreign higher education students. There was a drastic fall. There was massive number taken up by private students because of the entry requirement. Public universities have higher entry requirements than most of these private universities. But there's been a sharp fall for private students, and then of course it more or less stabilizes from 2019. While the numbers for public universities have fallen, but there's a slight rise among private universities. As I mentioned earlier, we have Zoom sessions, webbing, all sorts of this thing that doesn't discourage students from enrolling. Although, of course, students, my own interactions, I have over 30 PhD students, they are not happy that they're paying the same kind of fees when they don't have the feeling of a classroom, the socialization process that they require. Those kinds of elements are coming up. Digitalization and smart proliferation, IR 4.0, back closures of borders in developed countries. Of course, this actually discouraged, in fact, even my own son from going to do his bar in the UK. And all sorts of uncertainty means that, and of course, the UK example will be one that you didn't substitute that with Zoom sessions, simply because they were in a disarray, something that was also common in the US and many other developed countries. We have largely done well in that sense, even though we, in trend terms, we are facing a surge in both cases as well as deaths with regards to COVID-19. COVID-19 acceleration of social distancing and restricted spatial movement of people. This is another element that's actually attracted digitalization even that much more. In fact, there's a project we're working on at AEI with Huawei. Virtual classrooms, incubators, and lecture halls. While in one sense it reduces the need to get into heavy capital investment for infrastructure, but on the other hand, it reduces the element of socialization, the feeling human beings require. People require people to be able to function like people in a social sense. That sort of elements are somewhat missing, which is also seen in the manifestation of mental problems across the country and across the world. And it's also manifested in the Tokyo Olympics. Lots of competitors compared to the past Olympics suffering from mental problems, some even withdrawing from competitions. Rise of broadband infrastructure, IoT, cloud computing, big data analytics, robots, and drones. I would like to encourage this. This is my area of expertise in many ways. But at the same time, we need to see there is a balance with the socialization process. Between physical social interaction and virtual social interactions. It's always good to have new technologies that are helpful for society. We cannot be those like what Michael led, the mystical figure involved in when the automation was coming up that start destroying machines. And now we feel the Industry 4.0 coming up, will have another massive loss in jobs. I think we cannot take that sort of a negative view. There will be other forms of jobs that need to be a transformation to coding, to the capacity to be more cognitive, to realize what Paulo Freire often talked about. Human beings are different, and therefore they cannot simply day in, day out, push their wheelbarrows with bricks, transfer those bricks every day, and they don't realize the creative self. Their donkeys can do that. So this actually brings about the enabling of those minds, what the late Freire discussed extensively in Brazil. Proliferation of social media. Social media can be used productively. Of course, sometimes it's used negatively, but I think there must be ways to promote it through not so much stringent legislation by having all this severe punishment, but more so by cognitive awareness creation in a way where humans, because humans are not are able to appreciate that, are won over to use it in a productive way. Potential for aggregation of scale through merging of scope economies from mass customization. So you are able to do different kinds of tape issues. It's just like how it's being done in automobiles now, where mass customization is happening. In the interest of time, if there are questions, I can come back to that because I visited some of these developments in Perth. Consequences of disruptions and uncertainties. Uncertain changes in teaching arrangements, falling academic employee time per student, transformation of support staff. These are all immediate reactions and need not necessarily continue once higher education institutions absorb these changes and are ready to plan effectively. Transformation of learning skills with increased focus on interactive learning, emergence and expansion of virtual learning and the consequences for evaluation and grading. Things have to change. The only thing that is constant is change. And we need to catch the wave on that. Excuse me. Increasing integration in social, economic, and knowledge systems, so much so that even a Pachi who's selling vegetables in a pasar basah is able to think, reflect, in a way how farmers are being taught all this in India, for example, when to appreciate weather change, the use of bio-friendly fertilizers, and so on and so forth. Rising autonomy among universities initiated by falling government funding and rising utilization of adapted technologies. So this actually pushes universities like the Bayh-Dole Act 1982 US. Universities then start to become entrepreneurs themselves in finding ways to orientate research that's useful for society, that's useful for firms, so that then they can use that as a basis to make money rather than all the time depending on government. And governments are in any case reducing expenditures on higher education, which is a forced way to get there. Falling demand for graduates, rising graduate unemployment, forcing reorientation towards IR 4.0 associated with entrepreneurial activities, so that individuals then are able to use knowledge in a way we refer to as objective or critical knowledge that makes them into intellectuals in some sense, so that they become entrepreneurial. Ability to use it productively to support themselves and to support a wider range of people. Reorientation of use of knowledge from applicative to innovative and cognitive adaptation, rather than just applying whatever you learned, but you become innovative from duplicating whatever you study. You become, you adapt that, and you become, you call that creative imitation. After that, you cognitive, use your head to change many different things. A lot of things, some kids can do it, as far as I know. And in other words, these are elements, what the Japanese used to call under small group activities, or Kaizen, which Imai, they've been around for a long time, but we need to see its extension in a broader sense. Now we come towards economic and financial sustainability. I mentioned that public goods are not the same as public utility. Utility must reach everyone, but it can be excluded. Water, electricity, and so on, you have to pay for more and more. It's not onerous too. Public goods, no, that's not the element. The knowledge is already there. It's a question of how it can be utilized by more and more people. You don't need additional cost, except that if you need to bring more students into a classroom, you have to have wider classroom, but the unit increase in cost, marginal increase in cost will be minimal, negligible. Now you have to see that you catch the wave of Industrial Revolution 4.0. In an enabling sense, if you understand this the way I do, for example, or those guys working on it, it's an enabler. It helps rather than hinders progression of entrepreneurs and the creation of new types of jobs, rather than the same type of monotonous jobs that we have conceived in the past. Open systems approach to education, so that education becomes a shared entity rather than one that's defined strictly as a copyrightable intellectual property that's confined to those who own it, and then it becomes elitist. And this becomes a lot more one that spreads across the whole society. Transforming to meet society's needs, so that education becomes something not just in the creation of scientific knowledge, which is important, but tied to societal needs. It's a bit like, I remember giving this keynote speech when the Sustainable Development Program was launched at Cambridge. It's only after that they put me as one of the professor fellows at the Center for Rising Powers. And it's very obvious that the way human activity has gone, unless we do something about it, global climate change and global warming is going to swallow planet Earth. Now, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should immediately jump to, say, Mars or Jupiter, because the idea of getting there itself is inconceivable at the moment. So scientific research, which may involve billions of dollars, may go in there, but it doesn't give us a clear sign that that's a solution that can actually be realized. I'll come to that because I remember reading Stephen Hawking's statement before I gave my keynote, and Stephen Hawking had died. Financial, contraction in physical structures, expansion in digital structures, asset and cost restructuring. These are all things that need to be conceived. University top management need to focus on this. I think there are some universities are doing really well on this, including Universiti Malaya, because I view this as part of the Senate committee member for some meetings. I hope the other public universities are doing the same. I'm saying that not because I don't think they're doing it. I believe they are, except that I don't have knowledge about what's going on. From perspective of students, given contraction in utilization of physical resources, should fees be trimmed? Most students feel fees should be trimmed. They have little access to library, and they are not very savvy with the use of digitalization and accessing knowledge materials like scientific publications, even though those modes exist. In light of the above, should academic and support staff count be reduced? A lot of them are talking about making staff multi-capable to be able to handle different courses.
Prof, can we have your concluding statement, Prof?
Yeah, sure. Reorientation of knowledge acquisition and delivery, increasing entrepreneurial universities, funding for philosophy. Okay, let's. This is the concluding section. Sorry for the delay. In light of the objectives laid out at the outset, how should governments respond? I'm raising these set of questions. The disruptions and uncertainty gripping higher education. For countries seeking to shift from the bottom, catch up, and reach the top of the development trajectory, reducing the focus on higher education cannot be an option. How should governments restructure higher education to embrace the waves of changes necessitated by both the unfolding of IR 4.0 technologies and the COVID-19 pandemic? How will the focus in foreign higher education change with the new challenges? How will the role of SDI infrastructure organizations in the ecosystem to promote economic and social synergies change to meet the challenges of IR 4.0 and the need for social distancing? Are countries ready to accelerate increased rules for digital technologies to harness the potential for virtual and augmented realities in higher education and its support systems? While interactive learning and incremental innovations have a long history, how should governments promote R&D activities inclusive of IR 4.0, so they co-evolve, that emphasize adaptive and radical innovations to absorb the transformation essential to usher in the digitalization of higher education? Several governments embarked on transitioning the governance framework to a quadruple helix framework with the critical pillars of industry, government, university, and civil society when the United Nations launched the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Malaysia is no exception. How far have these countries gone to implement it and to realize its synergies in light of the public good characteristics of higher education? And as seen now from the mad scramble by biopharma businesses to keep discoveries and inventions private, how should governments manage the provision of intellectual property rights on such essential knowledge to reach the masses? It may be pertinent for the UN to fight these companies to allow generic drugs for the benefit of masses. Alternative funding to support public ownership of patents associated with these goods too will be necessary. As public...
Okay, Prof.
Okay, sir, my last line. Where R&D innovations are involved, the promotion of public goods and utility must emphasize the open systems innovation framework. Thank you, sir. That's all.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a lot of material you have presented. Let me go straight to the Q&A, Prof. I'll give you, present you a couple of questions. You pick up which one you're comfortable to respond immediately, okay? You may not be in a position to answer all. Let me pose to you the first question from TS2. He asks, Prof, will the academic be able to catch up with the industrial cutting-edge development to drive the industrial collaborative growth? What is your thought? That's the first question. The second question is from Suhaimi Muhammad Sarif. Prof, due to budget constraint, should government consolidate all universities to a few only that's relevant to socio-economic of the country? That's the second question from Muhammad Sharif, from Suhaimi Muhammad Sharif. The third one from Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman. Will virtual universities be popular in future, and how do you believe quality will be promoted and regulated? That's the third one. And the fourth one, the last one, from Ushrani Balasingham. Prof, are education players now industry, from our education players now, like industry, Google, etc., who might enter the education arena? How would this impact current landscape? So you pick which one you are comfortable to respond with the short time that we have left. Over to you, Prof.
Dato, Professor Morshidi, how many minutes I have? Then
it's about 3 minutes, I think.
Okay, then I think I can answer all.
Yeah.
Are academics ready? I think that should not, I think the question should be, how can the academics be brought to be ready? This is one where we are in a mad scramble, transitioning from the old forms of teaching to new forms of teaching. Second, we are facing a crisis that only took place for the second time in the last 100 years after the Spanish flu. So I think we will have to see that the transformation takes place among academics, rather than whether they are ready for it. That will be my answer for that. The second one, should universities be reduced to few because of the escalating costs involved in higher education? I think universities, by definition, of course, if you take the German model, it will be between the Max Planck and the Fraunhofer Institute being applied, or more theory and philosophy based. I think we could differentiate that way. I think University Malaysia Pahang is into that Fraunhofer type of orientation. we can orientate that way. But we still have 5 research universities, which is quite big. And therefore, I think we should not compromise on the salient features of a university, which is to create the engine of creating new stocks of knowledge, in transforming economies and so on. So in the interest of time, I answered those 2 questions, but please send emails. I'll be happy to answer those things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for your presentation and the short time that we have for Q&A. But I'm sure some of our viewers and the audience will be able to get in touch with you through emails and through other media to pursue the question that they have in mind. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dato. I sincerely apologize for the. That's why I prefer to not to go to the big screen so I can see the time.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. It's important that our audience got the presentation that you have, because the screen that you have earlier was not clear to our viewers. That's why I have to ask you to shift to the full PowerPoint. So thank you very much for your time and effort. And thank you all for joining us at the Global Higher Education Forum 2021. Have a good day. Stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to the moderator and our keynote speaker for the delightful sharing.